A new study found that LDL cholesterol does not strongly correlate with the degree of coronary artery atherosclerosis. This is a very important study. I'm going to talk slow intentionally so that no messages get lost in translation. This is a study that was just published in the International Journal of Cardiology involving 5,000 patients that were normal glycemic, pre-diabetic, or diabetic. And that was the first part of this study. They wanted to investigate and see whether the degree of diabetes or prediabetes correlated with coronary artery calcium scores. They also then wanted to see which diabetic-related biomarkers and lipid-related biomarkers were linked with the degree of coronary artery calcium scores. So this is really fascinating. Now, what they found is that LDL cholesterol was not correlated with the degree of coronary artery calcium plaquing. Now, this is really important because, again, most doctors like to monomaniacally focus on lowering your LDL cholesterol, but it turned out that HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol that is increased when you exercise, when you have a low-carb diet, when you have healthier fats and less processed sugar in your diet, your HDL generally increases. HDL, specifically the larger buoyant HDL particles, were more protective against both metabolic disease as well as the degree of coronary artery plaquing. And again, they used a CT scan to look at the degree of severity and calcification in the coronary arteries, including the left anterior descending coronary artery, the one that is known as the widowmaker and highly susceptible to becoming plaqued and atherosclerotic, and again, is correlated with major adverse cardiovascular events. But let's dive into this. This is a really important study. I strongly suggest you take some notes because we're going to dive into some aspects of lipoprotein particles. And I think this is important because, again, most doctors are measuring the cholesterol content in your particles, not the particles themselves. And this is a very important distinction. And this is what the investigators used beyond just looking at the cholesterol content of the particles. And it turns out that your HDL particles, your vLDL particles, your LDL particles traffic phospholipids, triglycerides, and cholesterol. But as you become more prone to developing diabetes and are on the path of insulin resistance, the composition of your LDL, HDL, and vLDL particles becomes enriched in triglycerides. And guess what? That is correlated with coronary artery atherosclerosis and plaquing, as well as a higher propensity to develop diabetes. And so this is really important stuff. We're going to dive into this. So the title of this study is Lipoproteins and Lipoprotein Lipid Composition are Associated with Stages of Dysglycemia and Subclinical Coronary Atherosclerosis. As I mentioned, this is actually ahead of print. This is going to be published in 2025, probably January, in the International Journal of Cardiology. There were 5,000 study participants that were part of a big cohort, I think of the bioimaging cohort in Sweden. And they also looked using a CT scan imaging to enumerate coronary artery calcium scores. And that is going to give us better insights into the degree of subclinical coronary artery atherosclerosis. And so I think this is important. And they looked at 225 biomarkers. Okay, so 32 biomarkers were associated with prediabetes and diabetes and were further investigated for their associations with coronary artery calcium scores. Here's what they found. The HDL diameter, the size of the HDL. Now, you're very familiar with HDL because it's known as the so-called good cholesterol, but there's different flavors of HDL. You have small HDL particles and larger diameter HDL particles. As you become more metabolically healthy, you lose the visceral fat, you exercise more, your VO2 max increases, you're cutting out hyperpalatable processed carbohydrates and sugars and seed oils and things like that. Guess what happens? Your liver starts making bigger, more protective, more health-promoting HDL particles. It turns out that this was the most sensitive and specific biomarker that not only predicted the degree of metabolic health, but the presence or lack thereof of coronary artery calcium, which is a direct reflection of atherosclerosis. And so this was the size of HDL was, among all the different biomarkers that they looked at, was the most strongly tethered with a lower odds of having coronary artery calcium. So this is really important. And they go on to say that there was no consistent association for non-HDL lipoproteins, non-HDL, such as vLDL, LDL, remnant lipoprotein or IDL, etc., and coronary artery calcium scoring. So what does this mean? This doesn't mean that in all individuals that HDL is never a problem, but in this analysis of 5,000 people, the lipoprotein, the cholesterol, if you will, the HDL, was most strongly tethered, inversely correlated with coronary artery calcium scores. There was not a strong statistical association with vLDL or LDL or IDL with coronary artery calcium scoring. And I want to really dive into this because this is very important. But first, I want to thank you for being here. If you're enjoying this content, hit that like button. Be sure to share this video with a friend because we're going to dive into the weeds in this study. I think you'll really find some value from this so that you can better stratify your risk of cardiovascular disease and also optimize your prevention because it's the #1 leading cause of mortality in this country. Now, since we're talking about metabolic health, I do want to remind you about a natural product that can not only help support your metabolic health and blood sugar health, but also help curb evening food cravings. This is known as berberine. Berberine has been used for 3,000 years. It's a natural herb derived from plants. And berberine has a unique ability to get you into ketosis faster, thereby elongating your fast. And also people find that it helps curb food cravings and supports metabolic health. It's been used for over 3,000 years in both Chinese medicine and Indian or Ayurvedic medicine. And there's hundreds of reviews on the Berberine Fasting Accelerator by Myoscience over at myoscience.com. You can see those reviews and see what other people are saying and how they're benefiting from this using the link in the description below. And you can save using the code podcast at checkout. So I'll put all that in the description below, as well as videos on berberine. But getting back to the study. Again, this study is really good because it helps us better understand how blood sugar dysregulation and even having prediabetes is linked with higher risk of getting coronary artery atherosclerosis and increasing our likelihood of developing a major heart attack and or a stroke down the road. So the investigators say derangements in both glucose and lipid metabolism characterize the clinical course of diabetes and increase the risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, the most common cause of death in persons with diabetes. So again, it's not only the most common cause of death here in the US and throughout the world for all people, but especially in people with pre and diabetes. Individuals with both prediabetes and diabetes have different degree of dyslipidemia, typically high circulating triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, and high amounts of small, dense LDL with normal or slightly elevated total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol levels are observed in individuals with diabetes. However, lipids and lipoprotein circulating levels and their composition differ greatly in individuals with diabetes depending upon the stage of the disease, metabolic compensation, and type of treatment. Here's where it gets really interesting, and this may be new to you, but this has been long known in the literature. Observational and interventional studies have shown, in fact, that LDL cholesterol levels may be lower in individuals with diabetes as compared to individuals without diabetes. I'm going to show you a table soon, but let's just pause here. Let's just go back and reread what they said. I know you heard me, but I just want to solidify this point because it's really important. Observational and interventional studies have shown, in fact, that LDL cholesterol levels may be even lower in individuals with diabetes as compared to individuals without diabetes. Now, here's what's interesting. As we just learned, the #1 cause of death in individuals who have diabetes is heart disease. Okay, this is well known, well established at this point. But it's also now well established that even in diabetics, their LDL cholesterol levels are actually lower than you might see in normal glycemic individuals, which is quite perplexing. And this is why, going back in 2007, 2008, 2009, I actually sold advanced lipoprotein particle testing to doctors for this very reason, to help them better stratify risk assessment for their pre-diabetic patients, because it turns out that you can really see the atherogenic changes in the lipids using advanced lipoprotein particle testing above and beyond what you normally get from commercial labs. Now, it's embarrassing to say this was a hard sell to cardiologists at the time, to family medicine doctors, to internal medicine doctors. They would look at me. Now everyone uses NMR or Berkeley Heart Labs or ultracentrifugation. There's a lot of different modalities to enumerate the composition of LDL and vLDL and HDL particles now. This is years later common practice. But back then, a lot of doctors were like, how is this going to change my clinical decision making? because there wasn't apparently a lot of emphasis in medical school on the idea that as you become more pre-diabetic and diabetic and more insulin resistant, the composition of your particles actually change. If I just have a book here for reference, imagine this is a lipoprotein particle that's trafficking phospholipids, cholesterol, vitamins like vitamin K2 or coenzyme Q10, as well as cholesterol. As you get more insulin resistant, let's just say in a healthy, metabolically healthy individual, there's roughly 50-50, if you look at this little border here, 50% triglycerides and 50% cholesterol in the lipoprotein particles, such as an LDL or vLDL particle. As you become more insulin resistant, the cholesterol content in the particle becomes reduced and there's more triglycerides in the particle. And that's linked with increased atherosclerosis, and that might be reflected in the serum as a lower LDL cholesterol level. But that doesn't necessarily reflect an improvement in metabolic health. It reflects actually dis-ease in terms of metabolic health. And so this is why looking at the lipoprotein particles is so important, and that's exactly what these investigators found, is that the composition of the particles shift in the wrong direction. They become triglyceride enriched, and that's problematic. And that's why we often see and hear about these J-shaped associations with LDL cholesterol and coronary artery disease, where individuals with really low LDL cholesterol levels actually have advanced or are at higher risk oftentimes for major adverse cardiovascular events and having coronary artery plaque and high coronary artery calcium scores, because the cholesterol content of the particles becomes reduced in relation to the triglyceride content. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments. I hope I explained that. And again, I think doctors are now finally waking up to this. It took a better part of a decade for this to become mainstream clinical practice. And this is why the investigators say, to this end, we aim to identify a dyslipidemic profile based on lipid and lipoprotein concentration, lipoprotein lipid content. Again, that would mean the amount of cholesterol versus triglyceride in the particles, and metabolites able to discern individuals across 3 glycemic categories defined as normal glycemic, pre-diabetic, or diabetic. Okay. That was a lot of jargon. Let's get to the simple tables. The tables, I think, tell the story. So we see the normal glycemic patients, the pre-diabetic patients, and the diabetic patients here in table 1. Now, what I think is interesting about this table is, first of all, the relative proportions of normal glycemic individuals who do moderate or vigorous physical activity compared to the people who have diabetes and do really low amounts of all types of exercise. And so I think that's really important. We know that exercise is a great way to increase your HDL. This is the thing. So HDL is increased by lifestyle. And that's why we don't hear a lot of mainstream doctors talking about this, because there's not a pill, there's not a drug, there's not a statin that will increase HDL. You have to earn it by way of exercise. So I think that's really interesting. Now, going to table 2, this is where things get even a little bit more curious. As you can see here, the coronary artery calcium scoring, meaning the degree of plaquing, was much more common in diabetics. It was present in 62% of diabetics compared to just 44% of individuals with prediabetes and only 37% of individuals with normal glycemia. Isn't that interesting? Now, let's go on and look at LDL. As you can see here, low density lipoprotein, the so-called bad cholesterol, as you can imagine, it is going down in individuals. So remember, 62% of the diabetics had high coronary artery calcium scores. But when we compare LDL cholesterol in the normal glycemic group, which only had 37% of these individuals had high coronary artery calcium scores, the individuals had higher LDL cholesterol in the normal glycemic group compared to the pre and full-on diabetic group. You can see the LDL cholesterol, and this is nanomoles per liter, goes from 3.5 nanomoles per liter in the normal glycemic group, and it drops down to 2.7 in the diabetic group. But remember, coronary artery calcium scoring was significantly higher in 62% of the diabetics compared to only 37% of the non-diabetics and 44% of the pre-diabetics. And so there is not a strong relationship with LDL cholesterol. And we'll see that on the next slide, which is what I think is interesting. And we also see an inverse association. If you look at the characteristics here, HDL cholesterol is much higher in the normal glycemic group compared to the pre-diabetic group. C-reactive protein is much lower in the normal glycemic group compared to the diabetic group. And you can see here the calcium scoring of the different coronary arteries and so forth. And I think that's very interesting. Blood pressure was much higher in the diabetics compared to the non-diabetics. Weight-to-hip ratio is much higher in the diabetics compared to the non-diabetics. So again, if we're trying to optimize cardiovascular health and prevent a major adverse cardiovascular event, we need to focus on metabolic health, on visceral adipose tissue, on waist-to-hip ratios, on blood pressure, on increasing HDL. And also, it's worth noting here that triglycerides actually were significantly higher in the diabetics and pre-diabetics compared to the normal glycemic group. How often do we hear doctors focusing on triglycerides? They often focus on LDL cholesterol. So I know by now you're getting the story. You're understanding that there's this correlation with non-LDL particles and coronary artery atherosclerosis and so forth. Okay, so let's look at this figure here. This is the odds ratio. This is what I think is really interesting. And it goes back to the composition of the particles. Remember, we're just using this book as a easy way to visualize this. This is either an HDL or a vLDL or an LDL. Roughly in metabolically healthy people, it might be relatively evenly split between the cholesterol content in the particle because, again, your blood is water-based, so you need these lipoprotein particles to travel in the water and in the water-based plasma and blood. And inside them is the fats, because if you've ever made pasta, you put olive oil in your pasta or butter you're making mac and cheese, it floats to the top. It doesn't disperse well. It separates. And so that's why you need these particles. And as you become more metabolically unhealthy, they become triglyceride enriched. And that's what we're seeing on this figure right here. In the individuals who are diabetic or pre-diabetic, you see the ratio of triglycerides within the vLDL and the LDL particles is significantly increased. And they're only able to figure this out using NMR. And so you see here, there's the odds of the correlation with triglyceride-enriched vLDL increases the odds of the presence of metabolic disease by 100%. So the odds ratio here is 2. So 100% increase. And this is even, go on down the list, I mean, you see the cholesterol content of the particles is linked with a lower odds of diabetes as well as coronary artery atherosclerosis. So basically, this is confirming what we just talked about, that the composition of the HDL, vLDL, and LDL particles tends to pivot to be less cholesterol enriched to more triglyceride enriched. And that's why triglycerides, I think, are a great biomarker, because when you see triglycerides increase in the blood, you can also reasonably assume that they are increasing in the particles, and that is increasing the atherogenic nature of the particles, meaning that they're more prone to causing the coronary artery calcium deposition and atherosclerosis. So I think this figure is quite interesting. And let's further dive into this. The investigators say increasing circulating levels of small HDL is associated with diabetes with an odds ratio of 1.37. So the smaller your protective HDL become, the less protective those HDL particles are. And so they are linked with a greater odds of developing not only diabetes, but also developing coronary artery atherosclerosis, which is bad. They also say among the HDL lipid components, phospholipids in the small HDL, was associated with diabetes. On the contrary, the large lipid-enriched HDL was associated with a lower risk of diabetes. They say lipid components in large and extra large HDL were highly correlated with a lower risk of diabetes. They say an increase in the vLDL mean diameter was associated with diabetes with an odds ratio of 1.42, which means a 42% greater odds of developing diabetes if you have a big vLDL or high vLDL. I think that's important because vLDL is something that we should all be measuring. And we've talked about the vLDL to triglyceride ratio before and how that's problematic. So they go on to talk about some other lipoproteins here, but let's get to the conclusion, because I think this is really important. The investigators say the occurrence of coronary artery calcium was associated with HDL size, concentration, and composition. Consistently with previous observations in normal glycemic study participants, circulating levels of small HDL were slightly increased in those treated with statins as compared to non-treated, which we also observed in the group with prediabetes. The investigators say, in conclusion, we identified 32 biomarkers mirroring circulating levels of lipoproteins, lipoprotein components, and metabolites associated with prediabetes, diabetes in a small contemporary Swedish population. Among these 32 biomarkers, an excess of small circulating HDL particles, not good, you want your HDL to be bigger, was associated with the occurrence of subclinical coronary atherosclerosis, estimated by the coronary artery calcium score by way of a CT scan. Further, we showed that if lipid-lowering drugs were dispensed, the association of small HDL with the occurrence of coronary artery calcium scoring was modified, although the interaction analysis did not attain a formal statistical significance. In conclusion, they say consistently, we observed larger vLDL levels in individuals with prediabetes and diabetes, but also a relative increase in triglyceride concentrations of the vLDL, IDL, and LDL, regardless of the concentration and diameter of the single lipoprotein. I'm going to explain that in just a moment. Diabetes-associated dyslipidemia was commonly defined by the presence of high triglycerides, low HDL, and elevated levels of small dense LDL. Total and LDL cholesterol levels are commonly reported as normal or slightly higher as compared to the normal glycemic population. In our study, we observed that total as well as LDL cholesterol levels were consistently lower in prediabetes and diabetes than in normal glycemic individuals in the presence and absence of dispensed lipid-lowering drugs. Lower LDL cholesterol levels have been reported in individuals with diabetes in both observational and interventional studies, with low LDL cholesterol levels being associated with an increased risk of coronary events in the presence of high triglycerides and low HDL. Recently, biomarkers associated with LDL cholesterol were found to be inversely related to the risk of developing diabetes in the UK Biobank data set. Okay, what does this all mean? Clearly, there is a strong association with metabolic disease and the presence of coronary artery calcium scoring, which reflects the degree of atherosclerosis, which then reflects the risk of developing a major adverse cardiovascular event, which, as you know, is the #1 leading cause of mortality. We know that having high HDL, low triglycerides, irrespective of LDL, is linked with better metabolic health. It turns out that in individuals who are on the trajectory or path of developing diabetes, their LDL cholesterol levels can actually go down. So if we monomaniacally focus on lowering LDL or using LDL as the sine qua non biomarker of risk for coronary artery atherosclerosis, we are missing the boat. We need to further expand our repertoire of lipid species that we look at, and look at triglycerides, look at HDL, look at vLDL, knowing because the composition of the particles can shift as you become more insulin resistant. The cholesterol concentration of your lipoprotein particles goes down. And because the Friedewald equation, which is the way that your LDL cholesterol is enumerated when you go and get your physical or common blood work, it's looking at the cholesterol content, not the particles themselves. So that can give you a false positive. And that's why we are seeing statistically, there's a large percentage of people who have fatal heart attacks with normal or low LDL cholesterol levels. So it's time that we broaden our scope. Just, if you're looking through a telescope, just move out a little bit and look more at the bigger picture here. So where does this leave us? This leaves us knowing that exercise is really important, because it can increase the size of your protective HDL and increase the total number of HDL particles that you have, and it can lower your blood triglycerides, which can obviously are a strong reflection of optimal metabolic health, and therefore probably reduce the odds that you will develop calcified arteries and increase the presence of atherosclerosis. So download our blood work cheat sheet, go to highintensityhealth.com, definitely opt in for that, because on page 1, we talk all about this along with LP(a), we talk about fibrinogen, we talk about other ApoB to A1 ratios in this. But I think this study is incredibly fascinating. I really hope you got some value from this. I know we talked about some jargonistic terms and things like that, but hopefully the figures, the tables will really help you better understand the significance of this study and better help us make strategic lifestyle changes to optimize or lower our cardiovascular risk and optimize metabolic health. We'll catch you on a future video down the road. Until then, be well.